look all the way up towards the top of Sears Tower, you'll be able to see 5 little glass boxes hanging off the edge of the building. You might even see a camera flash go off in there, or someone's feet walking around if you keep your eyes on it. That is...
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy, and I am going to be your docent for this 60-minute architecture tour that we are about to go on. A docent is our first technical term of the tour. Don't worry, it is just a fancy word for tour guide. But I do think that it is pretty apt. The word docent is generally used in the context of something like an art museum. And the magnificent architecture all up and down the Chicago River kind of makes this river one giant, very, very open-air art museum. Now, as we get underway and start to pull away from the dock, I always like to get a sense of just who we've got on board the boat. Do we have any local Chicagoans on board with us today? No, fantastic. I could make this entire tour up. You'd have no idea. All right, how about a little bit further than that? Somewhere else in the Midwest, outside Chicago. We got some Midwesterners on board, all right. So the weather might be a bit of a surprise, especially considering how cold it's been the last few days. Happy December, everyone. You have picked a lovely day to be out on the Chicago River. Never know what the weather's going to throw at you this time of year. Please do not stand on any of the benches or sit on or lean anything out over the railings of the boat. That can end a tour very quickly. And of course, if you drop something into the Chicago River, it belongs to the river now. We cannot get it back for you. But I like to think of this boat as my dodgy time machine. Now, why is it a time machine? You may well be wondering, and having already got on board and underway, why is it particularly dodgy? That is because my job today is to tell you about the amazing architecture of the city of Chicago, both natural and man-made. And if I was going to do that in the most straightforward way possible, I would start 10,000 years ago with the creation of the Great Lakes and the Chicago River itself. And I would work chronologically all the way up through the present day. Some of the more recent additions to the magnificent Chicago skyline, like these 3 wavy-looking blue-green glass towers off the right-hand side of the boat. The St. Regis, which was opened just last year and designed by a local Chicago architect named Jeannie Gang. But one of the things I love about Chicago is that it is a living, breathing, evolving organism of a city, and it absolutely refuses to arrange itself chronologically for the benefit of my tour. So instead of telling you about Chicago's architecture in chronological order, I am going to be bouncing us around all over the place in time, like we are in a Doctor Who episode, or perhaps Quantum Leap, that is more your time travel TV speed. Now, I am going to throw it all the way back to the very beginning, 10,000 years ago, around the end of the last Ice Age, to tell you about the natural architecture of the Chicagoland area, the lake and the river itself. As the massive ice sheets that covered most of North America at that time melted and retreated, they gouged out giant depressions in the Earth's surface and then filled them up, creating the Great Lakes as we know them today, which contain 1/5 of the entire world's fresh water supply. As the curtain comes up on the modern-day city of Chicago, well, you know that this has been a pretty bustling area ever since that time. Ever since the end of the last Ice Age, folks have lived in this area. It's the closest meeting place between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, so it has been a very important trade route. All sorts of different people moved through and lived in this place. Folks like the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, from whose languages we get the modern-day name of the city of Chicago. Forgive my pronunciation here. The original name of this place is something like Chicagawa, which roughly translates to stinky onions because of the water garlic that used to grow along the shores of Lake Michigan. And that got mispronounced in French as Chicagua, and that is where we get the modern-day name of the city, Chicago. I have been reliably told that because indigenous languages do not map perfectly onto English, more accurate, literal translation of the name Chicagawa would be, man, that place really stinks. You can almost smell it if you put a little stank on it when you say, Chicagawa. I think it smells much better out along the Chicago River this fine morning. Now, the river itself, for most of its 10,000-year existence, it flowed east out into Lake Michigan. That's the natural direction of the Chicago River. But that became a problem for the city as it started to grow, because we were dumping all of our sewage and garbage and byproducts from the old Chicago meat packing industry into the river. It's also flowing east into the lake, and that is where the city gets all of its drinking water from. It started to make a lot of people very sick. So in the year 1889, we called in the Army Corps of Engineers, who still control the lock in between the Chicago River and Lake Michigan to this day. The Army Corps of Engineers dug a whole bunch of canals down the south branch of the Chicago River, connecting it to the Des Plaines River, which sits at a lower elevation. In doing so, we gave the water a different direction direction to flow downhill. So using just the force of gravity in the year 1900, we reversed the flow of the Chicago River. It now flows away from the lake west, down the south branch of the river, into the Des Plaines River, and finally out into the Mississippi, sending all of our water and garbage down towards the city of St. Louis. The city of St. Louis was not happy about this. We did not ask them first, and they did not want our garbage. They sued the city of Chicago. Chicago won that lawsuit. In part, it was determined to be a matter of life and death for us. Nowadays, the river is much cleaner, so it's not really a problem anymore, but it does mean that theoretically, we could take this boat all the way down the Mississippi River towards the Gulf of Mexico, out and around the coast of Florida, up the eastern seaboard, back into the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and all the way back here to the city of Chicago in a big loop. I'm now going to jump us forward in time about some of the human-made architecture here along the Chicago River. Our first stop is going to be the year 1924. With this white building off the right-hand side of the boat, it's got a clock tower up on top of it. That is the Wrigley Building. If you are looking up at the Wrigley Building and thinking, wow, kind of fancy for 1924, it's only 100 years ago, and this kind of looks older than that. Looks a bit like an old church. Well, that is on purpose. This is a style called Spanish Revivalism. The clock tower on top of the Wrigley Building is based off of La Giralda clock tower at the Cathedral of Seville, Spain. The bright white terracotta tiling around the outside of the building gets brighter as it ascends the clock tower, serving to draw the eye upwards towards the clock face. And that terracotta tiling is also so fragile that to this day, it has to be washed by hand using only soap and water. The Wrigley Building bears the name of Wrigley Chewing Gum Company. That is a big Chicago name. It is also the name on Wrigley Field, the baseball stadium just north a bit up Clark Street. That's going to be a motif on this tour, big Chicago names. And speaking of big names, I bet you'll never guess the name of the building coming up directly behind me. Built in the year 2009 by a Chicago architect named Adrian Smith. And it is, of course, Trump International Hotel and Tower, which is a great example of a more recent architectural style called contextualism. If you look up the side of the building, you'll see 3 flat patios ascending the tower. Those are called setbacks, and each one of these setbacks corresponds with the height of one of the other buildings around Trump Tower. The first setback is the same height as the roof of the Wrigley Building underneath its clock tower. The second setback corresponds with the height of this skinny rocket ship looking building off the left-hand side of the boat. That's Mather Tower. The third setback is the same height as AMA Plaza, this black boxy building just starting to peek out from behind Trump Tower right now. And if you look directly off the right-hand side of the boat, you'll see a wavy pattern in the first few floors of Trump Tower. That is another contextualist feature that mimics the waves of the Chicago River. So the building is built in context, both with the natural elements around it and with the other buildings that came here before it. And next up on the right-hand side of the boat, peeking out from behind AMA Plaza, we have 2 of the more iconic buildings on this architecture tour. I like to call this pair of towers the corn cobs. Their actual name is Marina City, but they kind of look like a pair of corn cobs. That's a funny nickname. If we like your building here in Chicago, we might give it a funny nickname. Some artists and architects really enjoy this. Some really don't. Know that Anish Kapoor, the designer of the Cloudgate sculpture down at Millennium Park, really hates it. We here in Chicago call it the bean. But it looks like a bean, so we're going to keep calling it that. Coming back to Marina City, this pair of towers was not actually designed to look like corn cobs. They were designed more with sunflowers in mind. Got this petal shape around the outside of the towers. It's balconies up towards the top. Underneath those, it becomes valet-only parking. If you're not very careful, you might drive your car into the river. That has happened twice. Once in a Steve McQueen film called The Hunter, and again in a car insurance commercial that was referencing that movie. Underneath that parking structure, there's a steakhouse, a seafood joint, they have a bowling alley in there. Underneath it all, a place for you to park your yacht. Truly, it's a city within a city. Everything you could possibly need in one location. Marina City was built in the 1960s by a man named Bertrand Goldberg as a bit of a social experiment to see if Goldberg could convince people to come back and live here along the Chicago River. There weren't a lot of people living along the river in the 60s because the river was still very dirty. That started to change. In the year 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and from that time forward, the river has been getting cleaner and cleaner and nicer and nicer. At the time of the passage of the Clean Water Act, there were only 7 species of fish found living in the Chicago River. Today, there are over 70. You see all sorts of different birds up here, and just last year, we found a massive snapping turtle living up the north branch of the Chicago River, who we named Chonkosaurus. There's another funny nickname for you. As the river has gotten cleaner and nicer, folks have wanted to spend more time out here. Directly off the left-hand side of the boat is a section of the Chicago Riverwalk, which was designed in the year 1909, but we only started building it at the turn of the millennium. It was completed in 2016. It's a great example of Chicago continuing to work on itself and improve itself over time. And another great example of Chicago moving through time is this building off the left-hand side of the boat that kind of looks like two buildings smashed together. There's a black dividing line running down the length of it. That's the Builders Building, and it was constructed in two different decades. The first section we'll pass off the left-hand side of the boat is from the 1920s. It's our first example of Art Deco architecture on the tour. Some elements of Art Deco architecture include deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward, and the repeated machine-cut patterning you can see around the outside of the building. But after this black dividing line, that repeated machine-cut patterning goes away. That's a postmodern section of the building from the 1980s, but it respects the same line established by the Art Deco section from the 20s that came before it. Having just introduced you to Art Deco architecture, you will see a much more massive example of it coming up on the right-hand side of the boat. This next building is the Merchandise Mart. You'll see those same Art Deco elements that I just mentioned. Deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward to that repeated machine-cut patterning, the gold squares and chevron shapes around the top floors and the first few floors of the building. There are also some massive heads on pillars facing back towards the Merchandise Mart. Kind of look like a row of giant Pez dispensers. These are the merchant princes of Chicago, men like Marshall Field of Field and Co. That is another big Chicago name. His name is on the Field Museum of Natural History. When the Merchandise Mart was first constructed, it was the largest building acreage-wise in the entire world. Built with its own train station, its own fire station. For years, there was so much mail going in and out of that building that it had its very own zip code. And as we finish passing the Merchandise Mart, we are headed into an area of the river known as Wolf Point, where the main branch of the river meets the north branch, which runs up to the right, and the south branch, which heads down to the left. Nowadays, Wolf Point is a modern focal area of contextualist architecture. We're surrounded by these shiny glass towers, each one reflecting the others around it, so that it looks like we're at the bottom of a glass canyon. Now, this tower coming up directly behind me, with the archway cut out of the bottom and another arch cut out of the top, kind of makes it look like a giant hot pocket or a deodorant stick. I had one kid once tell me it looks like a McDonald's apple pie. That is River Point Tower. And this archway at the base of River Point Tower is a contextualist feature, mimicking the curve here of the Chicago River. It's also structural. It divides the weight of that building around the train lines that run underneath it. That's what those circles underneath River Point Tower are. Vents from the train lines that run below the building. And this next glass tower off the right-hand side of the boat kind of looks like a giant upside-down mechanical pencil. That is 150 North Riverside. It cuts in at the back to avoid those train lines that run behind it, and it cuts in at the front to leave a 30-foot gap in between the riverbank and its front door. That is part of a modern Chicago zoning law that requires 30 feet from the river to the entrance. The more recent contextualist towers along the Chicago River, so that we can enjoy hanging out along the Riverwalk on a lovely autumn morning like this. But that does make a building like 150 North Riverside kind of precariously balanced, and all of the skyscrapers here in Chicago have to be built to withstand what is known as wind drift, the force of the wind on a skyscraper. Up towards the top of 150 North Riverside, inside the building, they have something called inertial slosh damper, which are giant tanks of 160,000 gallons of water, so that when the wind blows one way in the building, the water naturally sloshes in the other direction, keeping the building stable. I think that is a fascinating engineering solve. And also, I really just enjoy saying inertial slosh dampers.
Boom, now you can hear me.
Fun to say. It
Insane architecture, no, it's crazy.
Star Trek.
Bottom
Speaking
right,
of
there's some
busted
fabric.
time travel adventures.
Oh.
Now, this next glass tower off the left-hand side of the boat is Bank of America Tower.
do too
It's
much
got a
about that
different
one.
method of respecting that 30-foot gap that it's required to have from the river to the entrance. The top floors of this building are all balanced on these three-part struts, anchoring it to the riverbank. That leaves room underneath for that cutout where you have shops, cafes, some lovely
So you
public
guys can hear
space
me
to hang
now.
out along the Chicago River.
Put a
Bank
mic.
of America Tower is also notable for being one of the few skyscrapers in downtown Chicago with no residential space. That building is entirely made up of office space. It was completed in November of 2020, which is a
goodness.
perfect time to build a brand spanking new office building in downtown Chicago, just as the pandemic sends everyone home. It would be kind of like building a brand new Art Deco office building in downtown
downtown Chicago in the year 1929, just before the stock market crash, which is exactly what happened to this building off the right-hand side of the boat. Number 2 North Riverside. You'll see those same Art Deco elements that I mentioned earlier. Deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward, and the machine-cut patterning around the outside of the building tells the story of the printed word, because this was originally the home of the Chicago Daily News. But after the stock market crash in 29, the United States goes straight into the Great Depression, and then immediately into World War II. For about 25 years, no one was really designing big new buildings for downtown Chicago. When we got back to it in the 50s and 60s, styles and attitudes had changed. We get to the advent of black box modernism, typified by gateway number 1 and gateway number 2, these big black cubes off the right-hand side of the boat. Black box modernism was a style pioneered by a man named Mies van der Rohe. You may be familiar with the expression that he popularized: less is more. Mies van der Rohe firmly believed that form follows function. So, what is the function of an office building? Well, it has to have space inside for a whole bunch of cubicles. So by moving the steel supports to the outside of the building and leaving them exposed, you free up space inside for those cubicles to be stacked ever closer together, turning a whole bunch of little cubes into one giant cube. This is also going to be a great opportunity to look directly underneath gateway number 2. You can make out the train lines that run underneath this tower. Now, the train companies own all of the land along this bank of the river, leading up towards Union Station. So the towers built on top of the tracks have to lease their air right from the train companies that own the land beneath them. Moving forward into the 1970s, people thought, okay, black box modernism was a good idea. It's a little bit dour if you do it all the time. So what if we make them brighter now instead? This white tower off the right-hand side of the boat is gateway number 3. Gateway number 3 is a great example of something called international style, because buildings that look like this started to pop up all over the world in the 1970s. Functionally the same as a black box modernist building, you've covered those exposed steel supports in that white siding, and that makes the building cheaper to cool in the summer. That white siding reflects heat. Jumping ahead again into the 1980s, we get to the dawn of contextualism. This shinier glass tower off the right-hand side of the boat is, of course, gateway number 4. You can see those contextualist features that I mentioned earlier. The glass is more reflective, and there's a curve down the middle of the building representing the curve of the Chicago River, which you can also see represented on the giant map off the left-hand side of the boat. It is plastered onto the side of 300 South Wacker. One of the things I like about this map is that it shows us where we've been. If you look all the way up towards the top of this building, you'll see a Y shape. That's Wolf Point, where the 3 branches of the river come together. The south branch comes down the side of the building to where we are now, represented by that giant red marker. That is a big old "You Are Here" sign on the side of 300 South Wacker. And jumping back over to gateway number 4 for a moment, you may recognize this building for a supporting role that it had in the film The Dark Knight. This is the building at the beginning of the movie that the Joker's men gathered towards the top of, shooting their zip lines over this road to Gotham City Bank. Gotham City Bank in that film, played by our old Main Post Office. At the time of filming, this building sat empty. Nowadays, it is office space for companies like Uber, Walgreens, and Pepsi. But at the time of its construction, this was the largest post office in the entire world. That is because there was so much mail coming in and out of Chicago from the mail order companies that were based here. Companies like Marshall Field & Co. or Sears and Roebuck. Sears, that is another big Chicago name, which we will be talking about later after we turn the boat around. And the Old Main Post Office is also an Art Deco building with deep inset windows, long vertical lines that draw the eye upward to some machine-cut patterning in the shape of American eagles. And the building is so large that as we pass underneath this road, Congress Parkway, and out the other side, we will still not be done passing the Old Main Post Office. That road runs straight through the center of the building. When the building was first constructed, Congress Parkway wasn't even here yet, but we knew it was planned for, so they left a space for it to drive through the middle of the postal building. I love that they built them an Art Deco masterpiece to carry mail out of. You'll see the post office did not go far. There are some postal vehicles off the right side of the boat. They are parked outside of their current building, which is fine. Like, it's okay, I guess. But this is definitely not an Art Deco masterpiece. As we continue down the the south branch of the Chicago River, I have lost all control of this time travel adventure, and I have landed us in the year 1871. That means that it is time for me to talk about the Chicago Fire, by which I do not mean the show on NBC, nor indeed the Major League Soccer team that we named the Chicago Fire. I mean the actual Great Chicago Fire of October 8th, 1871. At that time, just a few blocks west of where we are right now, there stood a house owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. At that house, they had a barn. In that barn, there lived a cow. Now, nobody knows exactly how the Great Chicago Fire started, but if you are humming a little ditty in your head about the cow kicking the lantern over, you could be forgiven. And that is because the rumor that Catherine O'Leary's cow maliciously and with evil intent kicked over a lantern to burn down the city of Chicago appeared in print almost immediately after the fire was put out. Folks were so upset about the devastation the fire had caused, they were looking for someone, anyone, to blame. I think Mrs. O'Leary and her cow provided a convenient scapegoat. But Catherine O'Leary was fiercely protective of her cow. She said, absolutely not. I didn't leave a lantern in the barn. My entire family was asleep at the time. My cow is innocent. Over the years, many theories have been put forward as to how the Chicago Fire may have started. Anything from thieves in the barn knocking over a lantern, making a hasty getaway, to a pretty out there theory about a meteor shower that was observed in the area at the time, and that a chunk of flaming space rock may have fallen through the roof of the O'Leary's barn and ignited the Chicago Fire. However it started, the city of Chicago officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary and her cow in the year 1997. That is the one way we know the fire did not start. It quickly spread, though, here to the south branch of the river. You'd hope that might act as a fire break, but there were winds that night of up to 70 miles per hour, which shot burning material up and over the south branch of the river into a neighborhood known as Printers Row, because it was where we printed all of the newspapers at the time. From there, the fire quickly spread into downtown. Burning material fell on top of the roof of the old water pump station, gutting it from the inside, after which there was no longer any power to pump the water to fight the fire. We had to just wait until the fire burned itself out along the shores of Lake Michigan 3 days later. By that time, over 300 people had died. A third of the city was homeless, and the modern equivalent of $8 billion in damage had been done. Chicago was destroyed. The city started to rebuild itself almost immediately. Aid poured in from all over the country, and indeed all over the world, including a donation of 8,000 books from the city of London, England, which became the basis of the Chicago Public Library system. What also comes pouring into Chicago around this time are architects. The city needed to rebuild itself quickly using new and innovative methods, so architects came from all over. One of the architects operating in Chicago at this time was a man named Daniel Burnham, one of the founders of something called the City Beautiful movement. In the year 1909, when Daniel Burnham was commissioned by the city of Chicago to develop an urban plan for the city moving forward as it continued to grow and rebuild after the fire. We've seen some elements of Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan already on the tour today. Things like the Chicago Riverwalk, which was only completed in 2016, and Congress Parkway, which runs underneath the old Main Post Office. One of the foundations of the City Beautiful movement was city planning. The idea was that living and working around beautiful spaces and buildings and well-thought-out cities made people's lives better, made them want to be better people even. So included on Burnham's plan were many of Chicago's over 600 public parks. Just about everyone who lives in Chicago lives within walking distance of at least one public park, and the Latin motto of the city is Urbs in Horto, which translates to city in a garden. And the buildings were also conceived of to be beautiful moving forwards, but what makes a building beautiful means different things to different folks. This curvy-looking building off the right-hand side of the boat is called River City. It's got some elements that you may recognize from earlier. That curvilinear pattern looks a bit like a flower petal, or maybe even a corn cob, and underneath there's a place to park your boat. And that's because River City was designed by Bertrand Goldberg, the same man who designed Marina City that we saw earlier on the tour. And Goldberg was a student of Mies van der Rohe. Goldberg thought there are no right angles in nature, so we shouldn't design them into our buildings. That S-curve around the outside of River City also shields the balconies on the inside of its curve from the wind. It does get quite windy sometimes here in the windy city of Chicago. That name did originally refer to the wind whipping in off of Lake Michigan, but it also came to refer to Chicago's windbag politicians, a connotation that it still carries today. Now, if you keep your eyes up to the right-hand side of the boat, you'll see what looks like a little silver Oscar statuette perched up on top of an Art Deco tower. That is the Roman goddess Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. She actually stands over 30 feet tall, and the reason the Roman goddess of agriculture is up there is that is the the Chicago Board of Trade, where they sold agricultural stock. The name Ceres is the root of a few words that we still use today. Words like cereal, made from grain. Grains are great. You could do so much with them. Now, rising up behind me, we have a pink Texas granite building with what looks like a crown or barrel of lights up on top of it. That is 311 South Wacker. And that crown of lights, when it first lit up, was so bright that it was confusing migratory birds who thought it was the moon, which they used to navigate, and they were getting lost. This turned into a pretty grisly scene. Some of those birds were dying of exhaustion at the base of the tower. So nowadays, twice a year, the lights up on top of 311 South Wacker are dimmed for migratory bird season. Looming up behind 311 South Wacker, we have the tallest and probably most famous building on this architecture tour. Rising nearly 1,500 feet into the air, this gargantuan example of black box modernism has a name. That name is spelt W-I-L-L-I-S. We have a kind of funny way of pronouncing that here in the city of Chicago. We pronounce that Sears. This is the Sears Tower. Now, its actual name nowadays is the Willis Tower, and I'll get into why that name changed in just a moment. But if you take a close look at it, you'll see that it's not really one tower. It's 9 towers bundled together. That is another method of combating wind drift, force of the wind on a skyscraper. Only the 2 tallest sections go all the way to the top. The shorter sections buttress the weight of the building, keep it from tipping over in the wind. Sears Tower is built to withstand winds of up to 200 miles per hour, and it can sway up to 18 inches in any direction. Told on a very windy day at the top of that building, you can see the water in the toilet sloshing back and forth in their bowls. Now, when you name a giant skyscraper like this, you don't buy the naming rights outright. You lease them from year to year. The Sears Company, who that building is originally named for, isn't as big as it used to be. A few years ago, they decided they didn't want to pay for the name anymore. So the Willis Group, which has a few floors in the tower, took over. They've been paying about $1 million year by year to have that building officially named Willis Tower. But Chicagoans are a stubborn lot, and we don't like change. The locals will probably forever and always be referring to that building as Sears Tower. If you look all the way up towards the top of Sears Tower, you'll be able to see 5 little glass boxes hanging off the edge of the building. You might even see a camera flash go off in there, or someone's feet walking around if you keep your eyes on it. That is the Chicago Sky Deck. You can take an elevator all the way up towards the top of Sears Tower and step out into one of those little glass boxes nearly 1,500 feet above the pavement. You could even do jumping jacks or dance around in there. They are very secure. I wouldn't, but you can. The elevators that take you up towards the Chicago Skydeck are some of the fastest elevators in the entire world. Heading up them, you'd be leaving the Earth's surface so quickly that you would experience increased G-force on your body, just like an astronaut heading towards the moon. Hello, new friends. Always making friends along the Chicago River. Heading up towards the Skydeck, you would weigh 1.2 Gs because of that increased gravity. When it was first constructed, the Sears Tower was the tallest building in the entire world. It no longer is. That honor goes to the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. The Sears Tower is no longer even the tallest building in the United States. That would be One World Trade Center in New York. However, if you were to somehow pick up the Sears Tower and drop it down right next to One World Trade Center and stand on the roof, you could look down from the roof of Sears Tower to the roof of One World Trade Center. That is possible because of a quirk in how we measure the height of skyscrapers. One World Trade Center has a spire on top of it. You can't go up it and you can't stand on it, but it is part of the artistic design of the building, so it counts in the overall height. Now, Sears Tower has a couple of spiky things on top of it as well, but those are antennae, classified as electrical equipment. They are not part of the artistic design of the building, so they don't count in its height, meaning New York has Chicago beat on a technicality. Yeah. And we are about to head back into an area of the river that we like to call the Art Deco Valley. We've already talked about number 2 North Riverside off the left-hand side of the boat. Now coming up on the right-hand side of the boat, we have another big Art Deco building. But this one has got this big flat wall that comes all the way up to the riverbank with no deep inset windows in it at all. It does, though, very helpfully have the building's name etched into the side of the wall. This is the Civic Opera building. It's actually just the Civic Opera building, but they're using the old Latin alphabet, and they didn't have U's in the Roman Empire. So a lot of civic buildings use that type of spelling. And this big flat wall is the backside of the theater inside the opera. It doesn't have any windows in it because you don't normally put windows in a theater. They want to design all of the lights in there themselves. And this wall comes all the way up to the riverbank simply because this building predates that zoning law. It requires the 30-foot gap of the more recent contextualist towers along the Chicago River. Speaking of more recent towers, this one off the left-hand side of the boat is the Boeing building. Got the Boeing symbol up towards the top of it. But this building was originally constructed for the Morton Salt Company, and there is a nod to that in its design. If you look all the way up to the top of the building, you'll see a steel plate with 6 holes in it. You can see the blue sky up through there. Now, those holes are not structural. They don't do anything. But from the air, they kind of make this whole tower look like a giant Morton salt shaker, which I think is adorable. I love it when architects put little jokes like that into their designs. Speaking of salt, let's talk a bit about the proper architectural construction of some of Chicago's favorite foods. Some locals will tell you that the most important ingredient on a Chicago-style hot dog is the celery salt that we sprinkle over top of it. It's as classic as this shot of the L train going over the Lake Street Bridge behind me here. Also on a Chicago dog, you get yellow mustard, chopped white onions, this bright green sweet relish, a dill pickle spear. You can even put spicy sport peppers or a slice of tomato on top of your Chicago dog. The one thing you must not put on a Chicago-style hot dog is ketchup. A local law that says if we catch you putting ketchup on your Chicago dog, you'll be loaded into a catapult and fired into Lake Michigan. That's a lie. You will get a very stern talking to, though. That is real. I recently learned a fascinating theory as to why Chicagoans might not like ketchup on their hot dog. Back in the old meat packing days, it was thought that the strong, sugary, vinegary taste of ketchup could mask the flavor of meat that had gone bad. So we don't like ketchup on our hot dog because we don't trust it. We think it's hiding something. Now you can contrast this very real, strong opinion about ketchup on hot dogs with what I have found to be Chicagoans' opinion of one of our other more famous foods. If I were to ask you, which is better, New York style or Chicago deep dish pizza? The correct answer would be that it's a trick question, because nobody cares. You can eat whatever style of pizza you like. Now, we love a deep dish pizza here in Chicago. They are delicious, but we eat New York style pizza sometimes too. We eat something called tavern-style pizza, which we cut up into little squares for sharing. Or there's something called Detroit-style pizza, which is also nice. You can eat whatever pizza you like. Of course, deep dish pizza is an item of gargantuan construction, good for keeping you warm in the winter. Another item of gargantuan construction is, of course, the merchandise mart, which we're passing again on the left-hand side of the boat. Now, the side of the merchandise mart facing the river in and of itself is nearly 2.5 acres worth of space. If you look directly off the right-hand side of the boat, you see a little glass case filled with LED projectors. And that is for a program called Art on the Mart, where in the warmer months, we project animated artwork onto the side of the merchandise mart in the evenings. It's free to come out and watch along the Chicago Riverwalk. As that show is going on, those LEDs are so carefully calibrated that all of that light hits only the wall. None of it spills in the windows. Coming up now on the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see a brick building with a clock tower up on top of it. That's the Reed Murdoch Center. The Reed Murdoch Center has a fraught history with Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan of Chicago. That plan called for the widening of LaSalle Street, this next bridge we're about to pass under. But the Reed Murdoch Center was already here, and unlike the old Main Post Office, they hadn't left space. So what were they to do? Well, if you count the columns of bay windows on the left-hand side of that central tower, you'll see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the right-hand side of the tower, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns of bay windows. And that is because they had to lop off an entire section of this building to make room for LaSalle Street, because you have to stick to the plan. After doing this, the facade of the Murdoch Center was adjusted slightly so that it still looks symmetrical, but it's an optical illusion. Coming up now on the right-hand side of the boat, sandwiched in between two very tall buildings, you'll see a squat-looking building with a big number 55 up towards the top of it. That is 55 West Wacker. It's a style we haven't talked about yet on the tour called Brutalism. Brutalism was a popular architectural style in the post-World War II years, around the same time as black box modernism. Brutalist buildings are constructed using a lot of exposed material, like concrete. They are supposed to look heavy and sturdy, not necessarily beautiful in and of themselves, but just like they're going to be there when you need them to be. Gave people a sense of stability after the successive crises of the Great Depression and World War II. And you can contrast that with some of the more ornate towers that we're headed towards in this part of downtown. One of my favorites is this green stone and gold gilded building off the right-hand side of the boat. It kind of looks like a giant champagne bottle. That is the Carbide and Carbon building. It's funny that it looks like a champagne bottle because it was constructed during Prohibition, when you could not get an alcoholic drink in the United States. The Carbide and Carbon building had the last laugh. They recently opened up a cocktail bar up towards the top of that building, and that's real 24 karat gold up there, beaten thinner than the thickness of one of your fingernails. I said it's one of my favorite buildings along the Chicago River, and I'm told that that's a fairly basic opinion. It is a lot of people's favorite building along the river, but it's just gorgeous. And that kind of makes me a proponent of the City Beautiful movement. Daniel Burnham's philosophy that living and working around beautiful spaces and buildings made people's lives better. Now this next skinnier tower coming up right after our new friends on top of that bridge is one I mentioned a bit earlier. It's Mather Tower. Mather Tower takes advantage of another old Chicago zoning law, puts no restriction on the height of a tower as long as its top floor is no more than 25% of the area of its footprint at the base. That top floor at the top of Mather Tower is only 9 feet wide. The Mather Tower is built in a style called French Gothic Revivalism. That's another European revivalist style, similar to the Spanish revivalism of the Wrigley Building, which we saw earlier on the tour, which we're approaching again on the left-hand side of the boat. Peeking out from behind the Wrigley Building, we have another more massive example of French Gothic revivalism. That is the Chicago Tribune Tower. It's got one of my favorite architectural features up towards the top of it. They are called flying buttresses, the arches that cascade off the top of this building and down the outside. Now, on an actual old French Gothic cathedral, flying buttresses like these would literally buttress the weight of the building and help keep it standing up. Tribune Tower has modern steel supports on the inside of it, so its flying buttresses are mainly artistic in nature, but they do make the entire tower look a bit like Rouen Cathedral in France, which it is designed after. Tribune Tower was originally home to the Chicago Tribune newspaper. They sold the building just a few years ago. Today it's mainly high-end apartments. It does still say Chicago Tribune along the side of it. Underneath that name, you'll see the big flat roof of the Apple Store. Kind of looks like a giant laptop. But the Apple Store is historically significant as the location of the first permanent residence by a non-native person in the city of Chicago. This is where Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, a Haitian man, built his trading post across the river from Fort Dearborn in the 1790s. Now you see Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable's name all over town on various bridges and roads, but of course we pronounce his name with a flat Midwestern accent, so we say du Sable. Now coming up on the left-hand side of the boat is a tall tower with the NBC logo up towards the top of it, and you might be thinking, I might know this one. We've talked about this style a lot on the tour. I see deep inset windows, and I see long vertical lines that draw my eye upward. This must be an Art Deco building. You would be wrong, because this building is playing a trick on you. It's from the year 1989, designed by Adrian Smith, our local Chicago architect. It's a style called Echo Deco, a postmodern style that makes certain callbacks to the Art Deco style that came before it. It may also look familiar as a sister building to 30 Rockefeller in New York. And rising towards us now off the right-hand side of the boat, we are back to those 3 wavy-looking blue-green glass towers I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of the tour. The St. Regis by local Chicago architect Jeannie Gang. We love Jeannie Gang here in Chicago. She is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. She's currently hard at work on the redesign of O'Hare Airport. St. Regis is the 3rd tallest building in Chicago, behind Trump Tower and the Sears Tower. However, if you were to stand up on top of the St. Regis, you could look down onto the roof of Trump Tower. That is because Trump Tower has a spire on top of it. But the St. Regis is the tallest building in the world, designed by a woman-led architecture firm. I say it looks lonely. This is Lake Point Tower, and it is the only high-rise building on the east side of Lakeshore Drive. And that's because there's another Chicago zoning law that says you're not supposed to build high-rise buildings on the east side of Lakeshore Drive, which leaves the lakefront open so we can enjoy all of the public space along Lake Michigan. Parks, the beaches, the bike path. But there was a loophole right here at the mouth of the Chicago River. I don't know what the city was planning on building at the mouth of the river, but I do know that it wasn't Lake Point Tower. So they closed that loophole, and that will remain the only high-rise building on the east side of Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable
Old Lakeshore Drive. As we do so, we're headed out towards that lock that controls entrance from the Chicago River out onto Lake Michigan. They're doing some construction on it right now. The lake generally sits about 5 or 6 feet higher than the river on average. Off the left-hand side of the boat, you'll see Navy Pier sticking out into the lake. Navy Pier has a fascinating history. It's been all sorts of different things. It was a barracks during World War I. During World War II, it was a training area for Navy pilots. Nowadays, it is home to things like the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, the Chicago Children's Museum, and our modern-day Ferris wheel. We do love a Ferris wheel here in Chicago. The original Ferris wheel at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair stood even taller than this one. It was 264 feet tall and had cars that could accommodate up to 60 passengers. 61, you include the bartender who staffed every car. I'll give you a moment to simply take in this glorious view of the Chicago skyline. It is one of the best views you can get of it here from the mouth of the river. If you have any questions, I can attempt to answer them now.
I'm not gonna lie. W out of the Chicago trip, what do y'all think? I think it's W's, bro. I think this is one for the books. This is a good start for whatever's to come next.